There is a clay tablet sitting in a museum in Istanbul that nobody talks about. It was unearthed from the ruins of Nippur, one of the oldest cities on Earth, and the cuneiform pressed into its surface describes something that should not be possible. The scribe who carved it claims that long before men learned to drag stones with ropes and rollers, the great builders of the old world had another method. They sang. They chanted in a low and steady tone, and the stones rose from the quarry floor on their own. The tablet says the sound was given to them by beings who came from the heavens, and the name those beings carried was Anunnaki. Tonight we are going to follow that thread. We are going to read the tablets and the temple inscriptions and the forgotten travelers' accounts that all keep returning to the same impossible idea, that the megalithic civilizations of the ancient world did not move their stones with muscle alone, that somewhere in the deep memory of our species there is a frequency, a sound that the rock itself responds to, and that the keepers of this sound were not mortal kings, but a class of teachers whose origin the Sumerians themselves placed not on earth, but in the sky. So get comfortable, dim the lights, settle into the pillow, and let your breathing slow. This is going to be a long, quiet walk through the libraries of the ancient world. You do not have to follow every name or every date. The story will carry you. By the time we are finished, you may find yourself somewhere between sleep and the desert wind that still blows across the ruined ziggurats of Mesopotamia. And if at any point you feel your eyes growing heavy, that is exactly as it should be. The voice will keep going, the stones will keep rising, and the old sound will keep humming under everything we say. If you enjoy these long-form journeys into the forbidden history of our world, the kind of stories the textbooks do not include, please take a moment now to subscribe to the channel. We post new sleep documentaries every week, and your subscription is what allows us to keep wandering into these strange corners of the past. A quiet tap of the bell will make sure you are notified when the next one arrives. And now, with that arse behind us, we can begin. To understand why the Anunnaki story has lasted for more than 5,000 years, we have to begin where it began. We have to begin on the flat alluvial plain that lies between two rivers, the Tigris in the east and the Euphrates in the west, where the soil is so dark and so rich that the first farmers in human history settled there and never left. This is the land the Greeks would later call Mesopotamia, which simply means the land between the rivers. The Sumerians, who were there first, called it Kalam, which meant home. And in that home, sometime around the middle of the 4th millennium before the Common Era, something extraordinary happened. A civilization appeared. It did not crawl out of the mud slowly the way historians used to imagine. It seemed to arrive almost fully formed. Within a few centuries of the first permanent settlements at Eridu and Uruk and Lagash, the Sumerians had developed writing, mathematics, astronomy, urban planning, monumental architecture, organized religion, codified law, and a system of trade that reached from the Indus Valley to the Anatolian highlands. They drained the marshes. They cut the canals. They raised the temples on platforms of brick and bitumen, and on top of those platforms they built the ziggurats, the great step pyramids that they called the meeting places of heaven and earth. And here is where the question begins, because the Sumerians themselves, when asked how they had learned to do all of this, gave a strange and consistent answer. They said they had been taught, not by their ancestors, not by trial and error, not by the slow accumulation of generations. They said that the knowledge had been given to them in a single act of instruction by visitors, visitors who had come down from the sky, visitors whose name in their own language was the Un-na-ki, the ones who from heaven to earth came. Now, if this were a story told by a single eccentric scribe on a single broken tablet, we could dismiss it, but it is not. The Anunnaki appear in the earliest Sumerian texts we have, and they continue to appear in the later Akkadian, Babylonian, and Assyrian texts that built on Sumerian foundations. They appear in the great creation epic Enuma Elish. They appear in the Atrahasis flood story, which predates the biblical Noah by more than 1,000 years. They appear in the lists of kings, in the prayers of the priests, in the lullabies sung to children, in the marriage contracts of merchants who invoked their names as witnesses. The Anunnaki were not a fringe belief. They were the central organizing principle of how the entire Mesopotamian world understood itself. And one of the things the Anunnaki were said to have given to the people of the rivers was knowledge of stone. The Sumerian word for this kind of knowledge was me, spelled M and E, and it referred to the divine ordinances, the patterns and procedures that allowed civilization to function. There were me for kingship, me for priesthood, me for agriculture, me for warfare, and me for the making of monuments. The me of stone cutting and stone moving was considered one of the highest gifts. It was said to have been kept in the temple at Eridu, in the care of the god Enki, the wisest of the Anunnaki, who lived in the freshwater abyss beneath the world. And it was said that the me of stone included a sound, a frequency, a way of speaking to the rock that would make it light. Now, before we go any further down this path, let us pause for a moment and acknowledge what most historians will say about this. They will say that the Sumerian texts are religious literature. They will say that the Anunnaki were simply the gods of an ancient people, no different in nature from the Greek gods or the Norse gods or the gods of any other pre-modern culture. They will say that when the texts describe the Anunnaki teaching humans how to build, this is a poetic way of saying that the Sumerians attributed their own discoveries to divine inspiration. And they will say that the idea of a sound that moves stones is a mythological detail that should not be taken literally. This is a reasonable position. It is the position you will find in every mainstream university textbook on the ancient Near East, and tonight we are not going to argue against it directly. We are simply going to do something the textbooks rarely do. We are going to take the texts at their word for a few hours. We are going to read what the Sumerians actually wrote, what the Babylonians actually copied, what the Egyptians and the Andeans and the builders of Baalbek actually claimed, and we are going to see what kind of picture emerges when we let the ancients speak in their own voice. And the picture that emerges, you may find, is stranger and more coherent than the textbooks lead you to expect. So let us return to the tablet from Nippur, the one I mentioned at the beginning. Nippur was the religious capital of Sumer. It was sacred to the god Enlil, the chief of the Anunnaki, the lord of the air and of the command. The city contained a temple complex called the Akur, which means the mountain house, and inside the Akur there was a library. We know this library existed because thousands of tablets from it have been recovered, beginning in the late 19th century, when American expeditions from the University of Pennsylvania dug through the mound at Nippur and pulled out a record of ancient knowledge so vast that scholars are still translating it today, more than 100 years later. Among the tablets from the Akur library, there is a class of texts that scholars sometimes call the technical hymns. They are prayers, but they are also instructions. They were chanted by the priests during the building and the dedication of temples, and they describe the procedures by which the construction was carried out. Most of these procedures sound reasonable enough. The cutting of cedar from the Amarnas Mountains, the firing of bricks in the kilns of the river plain, the mixing of bitumen and reed to seal the foundations, but scattered among the practical instructions, there are passages that do not sound practical at all. There are passages that describe a sound. One of these texts, written in the dialect of Sumerian that scholars call Emisal, which was the speech used by priestesses and by certain ritual specialists, contains the following passage, which I am going to read to you in a careful modern translation. The tone of the original is solemn, almost lullaby-like, and the rhythm in the cuneiform suggests it was meant to be sung. The text says, "The stone of the mountain is heavy, the stone of the mountain is the bone of the earth. But when the voice of An is upon it, the stone forgets its weight. When the voice of Enki rises from the Abzu, the stone rises with it. When the voice of Ninhursag, the lady of the mountain, calls the stone by its true name, the stone answers and the stone walks." Let that sit for a moment. The stone forgets its weight. The stone walks. These are not careless metaphors thrown in to embellish a hymn. The phrasing is consistent across multiple tablets from multiple cities and multiple centuries. The same idea, expressed in slightly different vocabulary, appears in tablets from Lagash, dated to the reign of Gudea, around 2100 years before the Common Era. It appears in tablets from from the period of the Third Dynasty. It appears in much later Babylonian copies, where the names of the gods have been changed but the underlying claim is preserved. The voice, applied correctly to the stone, lifts it. Now, you might reasonably ask, what does that actually mean? The tablets do not give us a recording. They do not provide a frequency in hertz. They were written in a culture that had no concept of acoustic physics as we understand it today. What they do provide is a set of clues scattered through the literature that have a strange internal consistency when you collect them all together. The clues point toward a method, not a complete description of the method, because the method, if it ever existed, was a closely guarded priestly secret, but a sketch, a shadow of the method, enough to ask the question seriously. The first clue is that the sound was not a single tone but a chant, a sustained vocalization carried by many voices in unison. The hymns describe choruses of priests, sometimes numbering in the dozens, gathered around the stone before it was moved. Each priest had a role. Some held the rhythm. Some held what the text calls the deep voice, which corresponds to what we might today describe as a low fundamental frequency. Others held the high voice, the overtones. The combination, according to the texts, produced something the Sumerians called the gish, kim, which translates roughly as the sign or the indicator. The gish, kim, was a phenomenon. It was something that appeared when the chant reached its proper pitch. And what appeared, the texts say, was a kind of trembling around the stone, a faint visible quivering of the air, as if heat were rising from it on a still day. The second clue is that the chant was always accompanied by a specific arrangement of objects around the stone. The hymns mention copper bowls filled with water, placed at the cardinal points. They mention rods of polished stone, often described as black, which the priests held while they chanted. They mention smoke, produced by burning specific resins, which was directed at the stone from particular angles. None of this would matter in a purely metaphorical interpretation. If the text was simply saying the gods are mighty and they helped us build our temples, there would be no need to specify copper bowls and black rods and resin smoke. The specificity is what is striking. It reads less like poetry and more like a procedure that someone wrote down so that the procedure could be repeated. The third clue is that the procedure was said to work only with certain kinds of stone. The Anunnaki tradition, as preserved in the technical hymns, distinguishes between living stone and dead stone. Living stone is described as stone that retains its connection to the mountain. It is freshly quarried. It still has, in the language of the texts, its breath. Dead stone is stone that has been cut and stored for a long time. It has been separated from its mother rock. Its breath has gone out of it. Living stone responds to the voice. Dead stone does not. This is why, according to the hymns, the great construction projects had to be carried out within a certain window of time after the stones were cut. If the stones sat too long, they became inert, and ordinary labor with ropes and rollers became necessary. The fourth clue concerns who could perform the chant. The Anunnaki tradition is very clear that the voice that moves the stone is not the voice of an ordinary singer. It is the voice of a trained priest who has undergone a specific initiation. The initiation is described in fragments across several tablets. It involved a period of fasting, a period of silence, a period of breathing exercises performed in a darkened chamber, and finally a moment of instruction in which the initiate received the true name of the stone, the name that the stone would answer to. The texts insist that without this initiation, the chant produces no effect. The same syllables sung by an untrained voice are simply syllables. The transformation happens, the texts say, when the voice carries the intention and the name together. Now you may be hearing all of this and thinking that it sounds like a perfectly ordinary description of religious magic. Priests chanting, secret names, special initiations, holy objects arranged in specific patterns. These are common features of religious practice in many cultures, and you would be right. The Sumerian description of stone lifting has all the surface features of religious magic. But here is where the story becomes more interesting, because the same description, with very similar specific details, appears thousands of miles away in cultures that had no contact with Sumer and that built monuments the Sumerians never saw. Let us travel for a while now, away from Mesopotamia, to a high windswept plateau in the Andes Mountains of South America. Let your mind go there. The air is thin and clear. The grass is short and silver. The sky is the deep blue you only see at 14,000 feet. There is a lake nearby, a great inland sea called Titicaca, and on the shore of that lake there are ruins. The ruins are called Tiwanaku, sometimes spelled Tiahuanaco, and they are old. How old, exactly, no one knows. Mainstream archaeology dates the visible structures to between 1500 and 1000 years ago, but the local Aymara people, whose ancestors lived in this region long before the Inca, insist that Tiwanaku was already in ruins when their own first ancestors arrived. They say the city was built by a different people, in a different time, by methods that have been lost. The stones at Tiwanaku are extraordinary. The largest of them weigh more than 100 tons. They are cut with a precision that modern stonemasons describe as uncanny. The joints between the blocks are so tight that a sheet of paper cannot be slit between them, and yet the blocks were shaped from andesite and basalt, two of the hardest stones in the world. The nearest quarries for the andesite blocks are dozens of kilometers away, on the other side of the lake, and the transport route, if conventional methods were used, would have required crossing water deep enough to swallow any raft known from that era. How the blocks got from the quarries to the building site is one of the great unsolved problems of South American archaeology. When the Spanish chroniclers arrived in the Andes in the 16th century, they asked the local people this question: how were these stones moved? The answer they received, recorded by the chronicler Pedro Cieza de Leon in his work La Crónica del Perú, published in 1553, is one of the most striking documents in the literature of forgotten history. Cieza writes that the Aymara elders told him that the stones at Tiwanaku had been moved by a race of giants who lived before the Great Flood. The giants, the elders said, had not used ropes or sledges. They had used the sound of trumpets. They had walked around each stone, blowing on long horns made of metal, and the stones had risen into the air and followed them. Cieza himself did not know what to make of this. He was a careful chronicler, and he wrote down what he was told without endorsing or rejecting it. He noted that the same story was told by different elders in different villages, and that the details were consistent. The giants, the metal trumpets, the stones rising into the air. He even attempted to verify the claim by interviewing an old man near the ruins who said his grandfather had once seen, on a moonless night, the faint trembling of one of the great blocks, as if it remembered the old sound and wished to rise again. Cieza wrote that the old man's eyes were clear and his memory sound, and that he did not seem to be inventing. We do not have to believe the old man. We do not have to believe Cieza, but we should at least notice the resonance. In Mesopotamia, the priests sang to the stones, and the stones rose. In the Andes, the giants blew on horns, and the stones rose. The mechanism is described slightly differently, but the underlying claim is the same. Sound, properly applied, defeats gravity. And this claim is not isolated. Let us continue traveling. Move east now, across the Atlantic, across the desert, to the valley of the Nile. The pyramids of Giza, the great works of the 4th dynasty of ancient Egypt, are the most famous megalithic monuments in the world. They are also, in many ways, the most mysterious. The Great Pyramid of Khufu contains approximately 2.5 million stone blocks, the average block weighing between 2 and 3 tons, the largest blocks, used in the relieving chambers above the king's chamber, weighing as much as 70 tons. The conventional explanation for how this monument was built involves a workforce of perhaps 20,000 laborers, ramps of mud, brick and rubble, copper tools, and a construction period of about 20 years. The math, when you work it through carefully, suggests that one block would have had to be cut, transported, lifted, and placed every 2 to 3 minutes, working continuously day and night for 2 decades. This is not impossible. It is the explanation that nearly all mainstream Egyptologists accept, but it is also not without its problems. And one of the problems is that the ancient Egyptians themselves, when asked, gave a different explanation. The classical Greek historian Herodotus, writing in the 5th century before the Common Era, visited Egypt and spoke with the priests at Heliopolis and at Memphis. He recorded what they told him about the pyramids. In his Histories, Book 2, Herodotus reports that the priests said the pyramids had been built with the help of machines, and that these machines were of a kind that no longer existed in their day. Herodotus does not describe the machines in detail. He says only that they were short pieces of wood that the priests called geranai, which the modern translators usually render as cranes or hoists. But he adds, almost as an aside, that the priests also spoke of a power that had been used to assist the machines, and this power was described as a kind of voice, a vibration in the air that came from the workers as they sang. This is a very thin reference. Herodotus does not dwell on it. He moves on to other matters. But it is striking that the Greek historian, 2,500 years ago, in the heart of Egypt, was told by Egyptian priests that the pyramid builders had used sound as part of their construction technique. And it is even more striking that an Arab historian named al-Mazudi, writing in Cairo in the 10th century of the Common Era, repeats a version of the same claim. Al-Masudi, in his great work Meadows of Gold, says that the builders of the pyramids would strike a stone with a wand of a particular kind and then chant over it, and the stone would rise into the air about the height of a man, and then move forward, drifting along like a feather on the wind until it reached the place where it was to be set. Al-Mazudi attributes this technique not to the Egyptians themselves, but to an earlier race who had taught the Egyptians, a race the Arab writer calls the people before the flood. You will notice the pattern beginning to repeat. In every version of the story, in every part of the world where megalithic construction occurred, the local memory of how the construction was achieved involves three elements. There is a sound applied to the stone. There is an earlier race, a teacher race, who knew the technique and who has since vanished. And there is the assertion that the technique has been lost. We do not know how to do this anymore, the local elders always say. Our ancestors knew, the giants knew, the gods knew. We have only the memory. This brings us to a place that I want you to picture clearly in your mind, because the picture itself is part of the story. Picture a valley in modern Lebanon, in the Bekaa region, about 85 kilometers northeast of Beirut. The valley is wide and dry, hemmed in by mountains on both sides, and at its center there is a town. The town is small now, but it sits on top of one of the most extraordinary archaeological sites on Earth. The site is called Baalbek. In Roman times it was known as Heliopolis, the city of the sun. The Romans built a temple complex there, dedicated to Jupiter, that is among the largest temples ever constructed in the ancient world. But the Romans did not build everything at Baalbek. They built on top of something older. Underneath the Roman temple of Jupiter there is a platform. The platform is made of cut stone, and the stones that form it are unlike anything else in the ancient world. They are called the trilithon, 3 blocks, and each block is approximately 20 meters long, 4.5 meters high, and 3.5 meters thick. Each block weighs, by the most careful modern estimates, somewhere between 800 and 1,200 tons. That is the weight of 3 fully loaded passenger jets. The blocks were cut from a quarry about 1 kilometer away, transported uphill across uneven terrain, and lifted into position 7 meters above the ground floor of the platform. Modern engineers have studied this for over a century, and they will tell you, quietly and off the record, that they do not know how it was done. The largest mobile cranes in the world today can barely move blocks of this weight, and even with those cranes, the operation requires careful preparation of the ground and a flat surface. The terrain at Baalbek is neither flat nor prepared, and in the quarry below, there is one more stone that was never moved. It is still lying there, where it was cut. It has a name. The locals call it Hajar al-Hubla, which means the stone of the pregnant woman. It weighs an estimated 1,250 tons, possibly more. It is the largest cut stone block in the world. It was prepared by the same builders who made the trilithon, and for reasons unknown, it was abandoned. It sits there today, half buried in the soil, and tourists climb on it and take pictures, and very few of them stop to think about what it actually represents. It represents a project that was started by someone, by some civilization, that had the intention and the apparent capability of moving a stone weighing 1,200 tons. And then that civilization disappeared, leaving the stone behind. When you ask the local people at Baalbek, the Lebanese villagers whose families have lived in the Bekaa for generations, who built the platform under the Roman temple, they do not say the Romans. They do not say the Phoenicians, who controlled the region before the Romans. They do not say the Canaanites, who were there before the Phoenicians. They say something stranger. They say it was built by a people who lived before the Great Flood, a people the local Arabic tradition calls the Anak, which is the Arabic version of the Hebrew word Anakim, the giants who appear in the Hebrew Bible in the Book of Numbers and the Book of Joshua. The Anakim, according to the biblical text, were a race of giants who lived in the land of Canaan before the Israelites arrived. They were said to be the descendants of an even earlier race called the Nephilim, whose origin, according to the same biblical tradition, was a union between the sons of God and the daughters of men, an event described in the 6th chapter of Genesis. The Nephilim, the giants, the Anakim, the children of the Watchers, the descendants of the fallen ones. These are all names that, in the literature of the ancient Near East, overlap with the same idea. There was, before the flood, a race of beings who possessed knowledge that ordinary humans did not, and one of the things they knew was how to build. The Lebanese tradition at Baalbek is unambiguous about what the giants used to build the platform. They used sound. Not just any sound. They used a specific tone, sung by many voices together, which the local stories describe as a low and steady hum, like the wind in a great pipe. The hum was carried by a leader, a master of the song, who walked around each block before it was moved. He sang the name of the block. He sang the place where the block was to go. He sang the song of the mountain from which the block had been cut. And then, when the song had been sung correctly, the block rose. Not high, just a hand's breadth above the ground, and then it moved, slowly, like a heavy cloud, toward the platform. This is folklore, of course. We have no documents from the builders of the platform. We do not even know with certainty when the platform was built. Some researchers have argued that the megalithic foundation predates the Roman temple by thousands of years, and may go back into the pre-flood period mentioned in the local tradition. Others argue that the platform was built by the Romans themselves, using techniques that we have simply forgotten. The debate goes on, and the stones sit there in the valley, and the wind blows across them, and the answer remains uncertain. But here is what is not uncertain. In Lebanon, in Egypt, in the Andes, in Mesopotamia, the same story is told. And in each case, the story involves the same set of details. Stones that should not have been moved by ordinary means. A race of teachers who knew a method that has been lost. A sound, sometimes a chant and sometimes a horn, that was central to the method. And a deep cultural memory that the knowledge originally came from somewhere else, not from local ingenuity, not from gradual development, from outside. Now let us return to Mesopotamia, because Mesopotamia is where the outside origin is most clearly stated. The Sumerians did not say, as the Egyptians sometimes did, that the gods had taught the first king and then withdrawn. The Sumerians said the gods had come down, in physical form, in vehicles they described as boats that moved through the sky, and that they had stayed for generations, walking among the people, teaching them, and finally departing. The Sumerian king list, one of the strangest documents to survive from the ancient world, contains a chronology of rulers that begins with 8 kings who reigned before the flood, and the lengths of whose reigns are measured not in years but in saroi, a Sumerian numerical unit equal to 3,600 years. The 8 pre-flood kings, according to the list, reigned for a total of 241,200 years. These were not human kings. They were, the text says, kings who had come down from heaven, the Anunnaki themselves, or their close kin, ruling the cities of the river plain in person. The first of these kings was named Alulim. He reigned, according to the list, in the city of Eridu for 28,800 years. Eridu is the city most closely associated with the god Enki, the patron of wisdom and the keeper of the Mi, the divine ordinances we discussed earlier. The Sumerians believed Eridu was the first city ever built on Earth. Archaeology, interestingly, has supported this claim. Eridu is the oldest urban settlement known in southern Mesopotamia, dating to around 5,400 years before the Common Era, and the ruins of its great temple of Enki have been excavated down through 18 successive layers, the deepest layer resting on virgin soil. The Sumerians, when they said Eridu was the first city, were not exaggerating. They were remembering. And what they remembered about Eridu included the manner of its construction. The temple of Enki at Eridu, according to the hymns, was raised by Enki himself, with the help of his craftsmen, the lesser Anunnaki. The hymn called the Eridu Genesis describes the construction in these words. Enki spoke to the waters answered. He spoke to the reeds answered. He spoke to the stones of the foundation, and the stones came up from the deep, and they arranged themselves, and the temple was made. The hymn does not say the workers cut the stones and carried them. It says the stones came up, the stones arranged themselves. The implication, if we read it without forcing it into a metaphorical interpretation, is that the stones were moved by the voice of Enki, the voice of the Anunnaki master, the voice that knew the true names of the materials. This is the kind of passage that mainstream scholarship will translate accurately and then immediately set aside. The translation will be correct. The setting aside will be done with a footnote that says, this is mythological language. The actual construction was carried out by ordinary labor, and perhaps it was. Perhaps the Sumerians, like every other ancient culture, attributed their achievements to their gods in a poetic way. But it is worth at least asking what the Sumerians themselves meant. And what the Sumerians themselves meant, when you read enough of them, and you stop trying to translate them into modern naturalism, was something more literal. They meant that Enki spoke to the stones and the stones rose. They meant it the way you and I would mean it if we said the carpenter cut the wood. It was, for them, a description of a procedure. Take a slow breath now, and let yourself sink a little deeper into the pillow. We have been moving through a lot of material. We have been to Sumer, to the Andes, to Egypt, to Lebanon. We have read tablets and chronicles and folk traditions. We have noticed that the same idea, the idea that sound can move stone, appears independently in cultures separated by oceans and millennia. Now we are going to slow down and look more carefully at the mechanism itself. What did the ancients actually claim was happening when the chant lifted the stone? What was the physics of it, if we can use that word for a process they did not describe in physical terms? The clearest source on this question is a body of tablets from the city of Lagash, dating to the period of the Sumerian ruler Gudea, who reigned around 2144 to 2124 years before the Common Era. Gudea was a temple builder. He rebuilt the great temple of the god Ningirsu at Lagash, a temple called the Aninu, and he commemorated this rebuilding with two long cylinder inscriptions that have survived almost intact. The Gudea cylinders are among the most important documents to come down to us from the early Sumerian world. They describe, in great detail, the planning, the financing, the labor, and the consecration of the temple, and in several passages they describe what Gudea calls the lifting of the stones by the voice of the Lord. In one passage, Gudea reports that the foundation stones of the Aninu were too heavy to be moved by his workers. He prayed to Ningirsu for guidance, and that night he had a dream. In the dream, the god appeared and instructed him to summon the masters of the chant, the priests of the older tradition, who still remembered the voice of the Anunnaki. Gudea summoned them. They arrived, dressed in robes of undyed linen, and they performed the rite. The text describes the rite in some detail. The priests gathered in a circle around the largest of the foundation stones. They placed copper bowls of water at the four corners. They burned cedar and tamarisk resin in censers of bronze. The chief priest, called the Gudu, held a rod of black diorite, the same kind of stone from which Gudea's own statues were later carved. The other priests held their hands flat against the surface of the stone, and then they began to chant. The chant, according to the text, was in the Emersul dialect, the high speech of ritual. It addressed the stone by name, not by its quarry name, but by its inner name, the name that Enki had whispered to the stone at the moment of its making, before the world was hard. The chant continued for a long time. The text says, the priests sang until the sun moved a hand's breadth across the sky, which we might estimate as about an hour. Then, the text says, the stone began to tremble. The trembling, at first, was small, like the trembling of a leaf in a faint breeze. Then it grew. The water in the copper bowls began to ripple. The smoke from the censers began to move in spirals, even though there was no wind. And then, finally, the stone rose. It rose, the text says, to the height of a man's knee. And then the priests, still chanting, walked slowly forward, and the stone followed them, drifting through the air at the height of a knee, until it came to the place that had been prepared for it. Then the chief priest changed the chant, and the stone settled, and the trembling stopped, and the stone was at rest in its foundation. The Gudea cylinder says, after this description, that the workers wept for joy, because they had not believed it could still be done. That phrase, they had not believed it could still be done, is important. It tells us that already in 2100 years before the Common Era, 4,000 years ago, the technique was considered ancient and rare. The workers were Sumerians of the late 3rd millennium. They were illiterate, sophisticated people living in an old civilization, and the moving of stones by chant was, even to them, a wonder. A relic of an earlier age, something the masters of the older tradition still knew, but only barely. And the text implies that after Gudea's time, the knowledge faded further, until by the late Babylonian period, 1,000 years later, the chant was remembered only as a story, and the stones were moved by ramps and rollers like everywhere else. If we accept the text at face value, just for the sake of inquiry, what can we say about how it might have worked? The first thing we can say is that the Sumerians did not describe the effect as magic, in the sense of an arbitrary supernatural event. They described it as the result of a procedure. The procedure had components: specific water in specific bowls at specific points around the stone, specific resins burned in specific censers, a specific rod held by a specific officiant, a specific chant in a specific dialect, sung by a specific number of voices, and a specific duration of approximately 1 hour. This is the language of a method, not the language of a miracle. The Sumerians, who had a sophisticated practical understanding of metallurgy, hydrology, and astronomy, were not naive about cause and effect. When they specified that a procedure required certain inputs in certain configurations, they did so because, in their understanding, Those inputs and configurations were what made the procedure work. The second thing we can say is that the description involves what we today would call resonance. The trembling of the stone, the rippling of the water, the spiraling of the smoke, all of these are phenomena associated with sympathetic vibration. When sound waves of the correct frequency strike an object, the object can be made to vibrate in sympathy. Every object has a natural resonant frequency, sometimes several, and when an external source produces a frequency that matches one of these, the object begins to oscillate at increasing amplitude. This is well known in modern physics. It is why a singer can shatter a wine glass with a note of the right pitch. It is why bridges can collapse under the rhythmic marching of soldiers. It is why an old refrigerator hums at one frequency and a different refrigerator hums at another. Every solid object has its own song. And, in principle, if you knew the song precisely enough and could produce it powerfully enough, you could make the object respond. Now, no modern physicist will tell you that sympathetic vibration, as currently understood, can be used to lift a 100-ton stone. The energy requirements are simply too great. To impart enough kinetic energy to a heavy stone to lift it off the ground, even by a few centimeters, you would need a sound source of impossibly high intensity. Human voices, even in choruses of dozens, cannot produce that much acoustic power. So if we are going to take the Sumerian description seriously, we have to either accept that the procedure involves something we do not currently understand, or we have to accept that the description is metaphorical after all. But there is a third possibility, and it is the one that the Anunnaki tradition itself seems to point toward. The third possibility is that the chant was not the cause, but the trigger. The chant did not provide the energy. The chant activated something. Something else, some other source, was the actual cause of the lifting. The chant was simply the key. And what was the something else? The Anunnaki tradition is, on this question, frustratingly vague, but it does drop hints. It says that there is, in certain places in the earth, what the Sumerians called gish, bil, which translates roughly as firewood, but which in context seems to mean something more like a hidden energy. The gish. Bil was said to lie in veins beneath the surface, like rivers of force, and the great temples were built precisely over the places where these veins ran strongest. The chant, when performed correctly, opened a channel to the gish, bil, and the gish. Bil did the actual work. This is speculative. It is the kind of reading that mainstream Assyriologists would find unconvincing, and they may well be right to find it unconvincing. But it is worth noting that the Sumerian texts do consistently associate the chant with a hidden underground energy, and they do consistently describe the great construction projects as occurring at sites that had been identified by the Anunnaki as places where the energy was accessible. The site of Eridu, the site of Nippur, the site of the site of Lagash, all of these were chosen, according to the texts, because the gish, bil, was strong beneath them. The temple was, in this view, not merely a religious structure, but a kind of resonator, a building designed to capture and focus the underground energy through the application of the chant. If this sounds like an ancient version of what some modern researchers call earth energies or ley lines, the resemblance is not accidental. The idea that certain points on the surface of the earth are charged with a kind of natural power, and that ancient monuments were built precisely over these points to harness the power, is an old idea that has been independently arrived at in many cultures. The Chinese had their concept of feng shui, which originally referred not to interior decoration but to the placement of imperial tombs on points of strong qi energy. The Celts had their notion of sacred groves and stone circles aligned to subtle currents in the land. The Andean peoples had their network of huacas, sacred places where the earth was said to be alive. And the Sumerians, the oldest of them all, had the gish, bil, the firewood, the hidden current beneath the great cities. Let us pause here for a moment, because we have covered a lot of ground, and your eyes may be growing heavy, and that is fine. Let your shoulders drop, let your jaw relax. The story is going to keep going, but it does not need your active concentration. The voice will continue. The names will roll past. The ancient cities will come and go, and whatever your mind picks up, it picks up, and whatever it lets go, it lets go. The point is to rest. The point is to drift through the strange landscape of forgotten knowledge and come out the other side feeling, somehow, that the world is larger than you remembered. Now we will continue. We will go, next, into one of the most specific and most puzzling claims in the entire Anunnaki literature. This is the claim that the sound used to lift the stones was not arbitrary. It was a specific frequency, or a specific set of frequencies, that the Anunnaki had identified through long study, and that they considered to be among the highest of the divine ordinances. The Sumerians called this the dub, Shen, which translates approximately as the tablet of the rising sound, the dub, Shen. Shen was said to be kept in the temple of Enki at Eridu, inscribed on a tablet of lapis lazuli, and it was guarded so closely that even the high priests of other cities were not permitted to see it. When the time came for a great construction, the priests would travel to Eridu, consult with the keepers of the tablet, and receive instruction in the specific tone required for the specific stones to be moved. The instruction was given orally. The tablet itself was never copied, and when Eridu was eventually abandoned, sometime in the second millennium before the Common Era, the tablet vanished with it. Whether it was destroyed, buried, or moved to another city, we do not know. What we do know is that the late Babylonian and Assyrian texts, which continued the Sumerian tradition with modifications, refer back to the dub, Shen as a lost artifact. The 7th century Assyrian king Ashurbanipal, who built one of the largest libraries in the ancient world at Nineveh, sent expeditions to the south specifically to search for the dub, Shen. His scribes write that the king wished to recover the knowledge of the old builders so that he could raise temples that would rival those of the ancient Sumerians. The expeditions, according to the records, did not find what they sought. They returned with many other tablets, copies of older texts, but the dub, Shen itself was nowhere. Ashurbanipal's library, which has been extensively excavated since the 1840s, contains the most comprehensive collection of Mesopotamian literature ever assembled, including detailed commentaries on the dub, Shen, but no copy of the tablet itself. It was already lost 2,700 years ago. The commentaries, however, tell us a great deal. They tell us that the dub, Shen was not a simple list of frequencies. It was a kind of map. It correlated specific tones with specific kinds of stone, with specific geographical locations, with specific celestial alignments, and with specific phases of the moon. The application of the chant, in other words, was not a matter of singing the same note every time. It was a matter of choosing the correct note for the particular circumstances. The note for moving granite was not the same as the note for moving limestone. The note used at midsummer was not the same as the note used at the equinox. The note used in the south, on the alluvial plain, was not the same as the note used in the north, in the highlands. Each stone, each place, each time had its proper tone, and the proper tone was determined by reference to the dub, Shen. This is a striking detail. It suggests that the Anunnaki tradition, whatever else it was, had a deep and systematic empirical character. It was not a one-size-fits-all magic. It was a calibrated technology, in the sense that the practitioners distinguished between different conditions and adjusted their procedure accordingly. This is the kind of variation we associate with engineering, not with superstition. If the Sumerians had simply been making up a magical story to explain their building achievements, they would have been unlikely to invent a detail as inconvenient as the requirement that the chant be modulated to local conditions. The detail makes the story harder to believe, not easier, which is one of the marks of a description that is being preserved rather than invented. The commentaries also tell us about the people who possessed this knowledge. They were called the En, which is usually translated as Lord, but which, in this technical context, refers specifically to the master of the chant, the officiant who held the tablet's instructions in living memory and could apply them to a particular project. The En was not a king, not a warrior, not a wealthy man in the ordinary sense. The En was a specialist, a kind of acoustic engineer in service of the temple. He was selected as a child, often from a hereditary lineage that traced itself back to one of the original masters trained by the Anunnaki themselves. His training lasted decades. He was taught the cosmology, the mathematics of vibration, the geography of the Gish, Bill, the catalogue of stones, and finally the actual tones, which he memorized in long sequences set to mnemonic patterns. By the time he was qualified to lead a construction project, he was typically a man in his 50s or 60s, with a deep memory and a strong voice, and he was accorded a respect equal to that of the king himself. There are tablets from the city of Lagash, showing the En standing beside the king in royal processions, sometimes in front of him, signaling the precedence of his sacred knowledge over the secular authority. The lineage of the En is itself a fascinating subject. The Sumerian tradition holds that the first En was a man named Enmeduranki, who is named in the king list as a ruler of the city of Sippar in the antediluvian period. Enmeduranki was said to have been taken up to heaven by the Anunnaki Shamash and Adad, the gods of the sun and of the storm, and instructed in the secrets of the gods. The instruction lasted, according to the tradition, for 40 days and 40 nights. When Enmeduranki returned to Earth, he brought with him the 7 tablets of divine knowledge, of which the dub, Shen, was the most secret. He founded the school of the En at Sippar, and from there the school spread to Eridu, to Nippur, to Lagash, and to the other major cities of Sumer. Every En, for the next 3,000 years, traced his initiation back to Enmeduranki, and through Enmeduranki to the Anunnaki themselves. You will notice that the figure of Enmeduranki bears a strong resemblance to the figure of Enoch in the Hebrew Bible. Enoch, in Genesis chapter 5, is described as a man who walked with God and was not, for God took him. The Book of Enoch, a Jewish text that did not make it into the canonical Bible but which was widely read in late antiquity, expands on this hint and describes Enoch's ascent to heaven, his instruction by the angels, and his return to earth with secret knowledge that he passed on to his descendant. The structural parallel between Enmeduranki and Enoch is so close that scholars of comparative religion have long suspected a direct historical relationship. The Sumerian story is the older. The Hebrew story is a later reflection of the same tradition, adapted to a monotheistic framework. And in both stories, the knowledge that the heavenly visitor returns with includes, among other things, the secrets of construction. The Book of Enoch is quite specific on this point. In its 8th chapter, it lists the various forbidden knowledges that the fallen angels, the Watchers, taught to humanity. These include the making of weapons, the use of cosmetics, the working of metals, the casting of spells, and, in a phrase that some translations render obscurely, the cutting of roots. But in older Aramaic versions of the text, the phrase that becomes the cutting of roots in Greek is more literally rendered as the unmaking of the bond of the stones. The fallen angels, in other words, taught humans how to undo the bond by which stones cling to the ground. They taught humans how to lift the unliftable. The Book of Enoch presents this as a forbidden knowledge, one of the things humans were not supposed to know, and the punishment for the angels who taught it was severe. They were bound, the text says, in the valleys of the earth, and the knowledge they had given was sealed away. This is consistent, in a roundabout way, with the Sumerian claim that the dub, Shen, was lost. The Hebrew tradition says the knowledge was forbidden and sealed. The Sumerian tradition says the knowledge was sacred and eventually lost. Both traditions agree that the knowledge did exist, that it had to do with overcoming the weight of stones, and that it is no longer in circulation. The agreement is not surprising when you consider that both traditions emerged from the same cultural matrix, the ancient Near East, with its long memory of the riverine civilizations that preceded the Bronze Age collapse. What is surprising, perhaps, is how detailed the agreement is, and how seriously both traditions insist that the knowledge was real. Let us drift now, very slowly, eastward again, away from the Levant and the Mesopotamian plain, toward the great river valleys of South Asia. The later Indian tradition, which we encounter in the Vedic and post-Vedic literature, preserves memories of an earlier age in which stones were moved by sound. The Sanskrit word for this art is Shabda Vidya, which translates literally as sound knowledge. The Shabda Vidya is one of the 8 great traditional sciences described in the older Hindu philosophical texts. It is presented not as a primitive folk belief, but as one of the higher disciplines of the Brahmanic schools. In the great epic of the Ramayana, there are passages that describe how the monkey general Hanuman, with his army, built a bridge across the sea to the island of Lanka by chanting over the stones and floating them on the water. There is a chant. There is a leader who knows the chant. The chant is sung over the stones. The stones become light, and they float, and they are arranged into the bridge. The mechanism, in all its essentials, is the same. The Hindu tradition goes further than the Sumerian, in one respect, by providing what amounts to a theoretical framework for Shabda Vidya. According to the Vedanta philosophical tradition, the universe was created from sound. The fundamental sound, called the Om or the Om, is the vibration from which all material forms condensed at the beginning of time. Every material thing, including every stone, retains within it a trace of the fundamental sound. When the correct tone is sung over a material object, the tone resonates with the trace, and the object's connection to the heavier physical world is loosened. It becomes, for a time, more closely identified with its primordial vibrational state, which is to say, less heavy, less solid, more pliable. The ancient Hindus, like the ancient Sumerians, did not consider the sound moving of stones to be mere magic. They had a model. The model connected the building of monuments to the deepest level of their cosmology. Outside, the wind is changing direction. The night is moving on. You have probably been listening for an hour or so by now. If your eyes are still open, that is fine. If they are closed, that is also fine. The body knows what it needs. The story will continue regardless. Take a slow breath. Let your eyes close, if they are not already closed. We are going to pause the journey now for just a moment and look at the night sky. The Anunnaki, you will remember, were said to have come from the heavens. The Sumerians were very specific about where, in the heavens, the Anunnaki originated. They said the Anunnaki came from a place they called Nibiru, which means the crossing place. Nibiru was, in the Sumerian astronomy, a celestial body that moved through the sky on a long elliptical path, returning to the vicinity of Earth at intervals of approximately 3,600 years. The Anunnaki, the texts say, traveled to Earth on Nibiru, or by means of vehicles dispatched from Nibiru during the periods when the planet came near. They taught the people of Earth for as long as Nibiru's orbit kept them in the local region, and then they departed when Nibiru moved away again, leaving behind their works, their cities, their tablets, and their lineage of the the masters of the chant, who would preserve what they had taught. The identity of Nibiru is a question that has occupied a great many writers, scholarly and otherwise, for the past century and a half. The most famous modern advocate of the Nibiru theory was Zecharia Sitchin, the Russian-American author whose series of books, beginning with The 12th Planet, published in 1976, proposed that Nibiru was a previously undiscovered planet in our solar system, on a long elliptical orbit. Sitchin's interpretation has been criticized by mainstream Assyriologists, who argue that the Sumerian texts, when read in context, do not actually describe Nibiru as a physical planet beyond Pluto. The word Nibiru in Sumerian and later in Akkadian could mean Jupiter or Mercury or the heliacally rising star of a particular season. Tonight, we are not going to attempt to resolve this debate. We are going to notice that the Sumerian texts do consistently associate the Anunnaki with the sky, with celestial cycles, and with periodicity. Whatever Nibiru actually was, in the Sumerian understanding, it was a sky thing. The Anunnaki came from the sky. They returned to the sky. Their visits were governed by the movements of celestial bodies. And the knowledge they brought with them, including the dub, Shen, the science of the rising sound, was knowledge that was understood to belong to the sky, not to the earth. The sky origin of the high knowledge is interesting because it explains a particular feature of the Anunnaki texts that might otherwise be puzzling. The Anunnaki, when they are not described as primitive or savage gods. They are described as highly civilized beings, with cities of their own, with hierarchies and politics and family disputes, with what we would call advanced material culture. They have boats, they have measurement instruments, they have a sophisticated understanding of astronomy and mathematics. They have, by all accounts, a technology that, while different from ours, is comparable in its complexity, and they brought a portion of this technology with them when they came to Earth, and they taught it to the locals, and the locals preserved what they could in the form of ritual procedures, prayers, and tablets, but the underlying technology was beyond what the local culture could fully understand. So it was preserved, in the texts, in a strange double layer. There is the literal description of the procedure, which preserves the steps that the priests were taught to follow, and there is the religious framing, which interprets the procedure as the work of the gods, because the gods had originally given the procedure to humans. The literal and the religious are intertwined in the texts because, for the Sumerians, they were the same thing. The procedure worked because the gods had given it. The gods had given it because it was a procedure that worked. This is a difficult thing for modern readers to fully appreciate. We are accustomed to distinguishing sharply between science and religion, between practical procedures and ritual procedures, between the technical and the sacred. The Sumerians did not make this distinction. For them, the practical and the sacred were aspects of the same reality. A procedure for making bread was a sacred act, because bread had been given by the gods, and the procedure had been refined under the gods' guidance. A procedure for lifting a stone was likewise a sacred act, even more so because it involved a more powerful application of the same principle. The stone-lifting chant was, in the Sumerian understanding, both an engineering technique and a religious rite. To perform it correctly required both technical competence and ritual purity. To perform it incorrectly, even with the best technical execution, would fail, because the gods would not honor an incorrect performance. This integration of the technical and the sacred is part of what makes the Anunnaki texts so difficult for modern readers, and also part of what makes them so fascinating. When you read a Sumerian construction hymn, you are reading something that is simultaneously a manual and a prayer. The manual aspects describe what to do. The prayer aspects describe why the doing is meaningful. You cannot strip the prayer away and keep the manual, because in the Sumerian understanding the prayer was part of how the manual worked, and you cannot strip the manual away and keep the prayer, because the prayer was always for the sake of accomplishing the manual task. The two are knit together. And what they describe, knit together, is a procedure for moving stones by sound that the Sumerians believed had been given to them by visitors from the heavens. Now we are going to move into a different kind of evidence, less textual and more physical. We are going to look at what the stones themselves can tell us when we examine them with modern tools. The great megalithic structures of the ancient world have been studied by engineers, geologists, and architects for more than a century, and certain peculiarities of these structures have emerged that are difficult to explain by the conventional construction methods that mainstream archaeology proposes. We will not draw firm conclusions from these peculiarities. We will simply note them and let them sit alongside the textual evidence we have already considered. The first peculiarity has to do with the fitting of the stones. At Sacsayhuaman, a fortress complex above the city of Cusco in Peru, the walls are made of enormous polygonal blocks of andesite, some of them weighing well over 200 tons. The blocks are fitted together with no mortar. The joints are so precise that a sheet of paper cannot be inserted between the blocks. What is less often noted is that the blocks are not merely fitted, but interlocked. Each block is shaped in such a way that its faces correspond exactly to the faces of all the blocks around it. There are no flat surfaces, there are no straight lines. The arrangement is three-dimensional and irregular. To achieve this kind of fit by trial and error would require an immense amount of work. To achieve it by a method in which the blocks were placed in their final position immediately would require either some way of precisely calculating the shape of each block in advance, or some way of making the stone temporarily plastic so that it could be molded to fit. The idea of temporarily plastic stone appears in the local Andean tradition itself. The Aymara elders said that the stone at Sacsayhuaman had been made soft by the giants, who used a particular kind of plant juice that they pressed onto the surface of the stone. When the juice was applied, the surface of the stone, for a short time, became like wet clay. The giants could shape it with their hands. Then the juice evaporated, and the stone returned to its full hardness. The plant juice story has been generally dismissed by mainstream archaeology, but the story persists in the local tradition, and it is independently corroborated by very similar accounts from other megalithic cultures. The Egyptian priest Manetho mentions that the builders of the older Egyptian monuments had access to a substance that could soften stone for shaping. The story does not have to be true to be interesting. The story is interesting because it appears, again, in multiple cultures, with consistent details attached to monuments whose construction is otherwise difficult to explain. The second peculiarity of the megalithic stones has to do with their surfaces. Many of the largest stones in the ancient world, including stones at Tiwanaku, at Pumapunku, at the Osirian at Abydos in Egypt, and at Baalbek, show surface features that, when examined closely, are difficult to attribute to known ancient cutting tools. The surfaces are often flat to a degree of precision, approaching that of modern machine tools. The corners are sharp and clean. The drilled holes, where they appear, show internal markings, consistent with rotational cutting at high speeds. The cuts and grooves, in some cases, appear to have been made by tools that left a continuous spiral curve. The kind of pattern that a modern circular saw might leave but that would be very difficult to produce with the copper and bronze tools that were the standard hardware of the time. The mainstream explanation is that these features were produced by careful work with abrasives, sand and water, and patience, applied over very long periods. This explanation is not impossible, but it requires us to imagine a degree of patience and a precision of execution that surpasses anything else we know from those cultures. The ancient Egyptians, for example, produced a great many ordinary objects with very ordinary surface finishes. Why would they reserve their highest precision specifically for the largest stones and the most sacred monuments? Unless they had, for those particular projects, access to a different and more advanced method, which they did not use for everyday work because it was rare, sacred, or reserved. Again, we are not drawing conclusions, we are noticing things. We are letting the evidence sit beside the texts and seeing what kind of pattern emerges. And the pattern that emerges is this. The ancient texts describe a method, given by the Anunnaki, that involved the use of sound to move, and possibly to shape stone. The ancient monuments display features that are consistent with the use of some unusual method to move and shape stone. The texts and the monuments do not, by themselves, prove that the Anunnaki existed or that the method worked, but they are at least consistent with each other. The story they tell, together, is internally coherent. It says that there was once a knowledge, that the knowledge produced these monuments, and that the knowledge has been lost. Let us continue. The night has deepened. The voice will go on. Let your shoulders relax once more. Let any tension in your jaw release. The pillow is soft. The blankets are warm. The story is wide and slow, and you do not have to follow every detail. Only let it wash over you, like water over stone, like wind over a quiet plain at the edge of an old desert. We have been moving through cultures and centuries, gathering pieces of a picture. Now we are going to slow down even further, and we are going to spend some time with one particular site, in one particular place, where the Anunnaki tradition is more concretely preserved than perhaps anywhere else. This is the site called Göbekli Tepe, in the highlands of southeastern Turkey, just north of the modern town of Şanlıurfa. Göbekli Tepe, when it was first excavated by the German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt in the 1990s, overturned much of what we thought we knew about the origins of civilization. The site consists of a series of circular enclosures, each surrounded by tall T-shaped pillars carved from limestone. The pillars are decorated with reliefs of animals, of human figures, and of abstract symbols whose meaning is still being debated. And the site is old. It is older than Sumer, older than the pyramids, older than Stonehenge. The earliest layers of Göbekli Tepe date to approximately 12,000 years ago, in the period that archaeologists call the pre-pottery Neolithic A. This was before the invention of agriculture, before the domestication of animals, before the founding of the earliest cities. And yet, at Göbekli Tepe, a sophisticated megalithic complex had been built, requiring the coordinated labor of a community that, by every other measure of the time, should not have been capable of such a project. The pillars at Göbekli Tepe weigh, on average, between 10 and 20 tons. Some weigh more. They were quarried from the limestone outcrops at the edges of the site and transported to the construction area, a distance of perhaps half a kilometer. The transport by conventional methods would have required hundreds of workers, ropes, sledges, and a level of ordicization that was not supposed to exist among hunter-gatherer populations of that period. And yet the work was done. The pillars were carved with detailed animal reliefs, lions, bulls, foxes, vultures, scorpions, all rendered with anatomical accuracy and an artistic confidence that suggests long practice. The pillars were arranged in deliberate geometric patterns. The whole site was constructed and then, after some thousands of years of use, deliberately buried. The builders covered the entire complex with earth, layer by layer, until it became the hill that gives the site its modern name. Göbekli Tepe means belly hill, the hill that hides the temple. Why did the builders bury their own work? Schmidt himself did not propose a definitive answer. He noted only that the burial was deliberate and was carried out with care, as if the builders wished to preserve the structures from damage while removing them from active use. One possibility, suggested by the layering of the burials and by the symbols carved on the latest pillars, is that the builders were marking the end of an era. They were closing a chapter. They were sealing away something that had been done, that had been important, and that was now finished. The chapter that closed in this view was the chapter of direct contact with the teachers. The Anunnaki had departed. the era of the visitors was over, and the temples that had been built under their guidance were buried, so that their secret should not be misused by those who remained. This interpretation is speculative, but it accords with a feature of the Göbekli Tepe site that is striking and that has received less attention than it deserves. The pillars are decorated, as I mentioned, with reliefs of animals. They are also decorated on several of the central T-shaped pillars in the most important enclosures, with reliefs that are clearly intended to depict human or humanoid figures. The figures wear long belts, they have folded hands, their forearms are precisely indicated, their bodies are stylized but unmistakable. These are not just abstract designs, they are portraits, or at least types, of beings who stood upright and wore clothing. And these beings, at the very top of the pillars, where the T-head meets the vertical shaft, have something else. Their heads are not depicted in the natural manner of a human face. Their heads are oblong, elongated, smooth, with no clearly carved features. The head of each central pillar is essentially a featureless rectangular block, as if to say, this is a person, but not a person whose face you would recognize. Who were these beings? The mainstream interpretation is that they represent ancestors, perhaps deified ancestors, perhaps the original founders of the cult that built the temple. This is plausible. But another interpretation, which the local Kurdish folklore of the Sanliurfa region preserves, is that the pillars represent the original teachers, the ones who came from the sky, and that the smooth faceless heads represent the helmets or the head coverings that those teachers wore. The Kurdish stories, collected in the early 20th century by ethnographers working in eastern Turkey, refer to the teachers as the people of the silent face. They were said to be tall, slender, and to wear coverings over their heads that hid their features. They had come from above, the stories say, in the time before the cold ended, and they had taught the local people how to build, how to plant, how to measure the year, and how to sing the songs that the stones answered. Then they had left, and they had been depicted on the great stones of the temple, with their faces hidden, because no living person was now permitted to see the faces of the teachers directly. To depict the face would be to claim a knowledge that no human had. The Kurdish folklore of Sanliurfa is not part of the academic record on Göbekli Tepe. It does not appear in the official site reports. It is a local oral tradition, and like most oral traditions, it is fluid and unverifiable, but it is consistent with patterns we see elsewhere in the ancient Near East. The Sumerians depicted their Anunnaki, in some texts, as wearing horned crowns, signifying their divinity. They were always shown as taller than ordinary humans. Their faces were depicted in formalized ways. The Egyptians depicted their oldest gods, the Netters, in semi-humanoid forms, often with animal heads or with stylized features that emphasized their otherness. The Andeans depicted their Viracocha, the bearded white teacher who was said to have come from across the sea, with a face partly hidden by a high collar and a tall cap. The pattern, across cultures, is that the teachers were remembered as other than human, but in a controlled and stylized way that respected the boundary between the teachers and the taught. The faceless figures on the central pillars of Göbekli Tepe fit comfortably into this larger pattern. If the teachers at Göbekli Tepe were the Anunnaki, or beings of the same kind, then the construction of Göbekli Tepe is the earliest example we have, anywhere on Earth, of the techniques those teachers were said to have brought. The site is roughly 7,000 years older than the earliest written records of the Anunnaki in Sumer. The Sumerian texts, in this view, would be preserving a much older tradition, one that goes back into the late Ice Age, when the climate was still cold and dry, when the great megafauna still walked the open lands of Anatolia and the Levant, and when small groups of hunter-gatherers gathered at certain sacred sites to learn from teachers whose origin they did not fully understand. The geological context of Göbekli Tepe is itself worth noting. The site sits in a region that is geologically active, with thermal springs, with subtle electromagnetic anomalies, and with deep underground aquifers that move in complex patterns. The local Kurdish tradition, again, says that the teachers chose Göbekli Tepe specifically because of what lay beneath. The earth here, the stories say, has strong veins. The water moves below, and the rock above carries the current. This is, of course, the same idea we encountered earlier in the Sumerian concept of Gish, Bil, the underground energy that the great temples were built to harness. The same idea in two different cultures, separated by thousands of years, both pointing to the same kind of site. Take another slow breath. Notice the warmth of your body against the bedding. The story is unhurried. We are walking through it. We are not running. There is plenty of time. Let me bring you to another stop on the journey. Let us pause for a long, quiet moment now. You have been listening for a while. Your body is heavy. The room is dim. The blankets are warm. Outside, perhaps, the wind is moving. Perhaps a car passes in the distance. Perhaps the house creaks slightly, as old houses do. None of it matters. The voice continues. The journey continues. We will keep walking, slowly, through the night. There is no rush. There never has been any rush. Now I am going to take you somewhere very particular. I am going to take you inside the king's chamber of the Great Pyramid of Giza at night, when the tourists have all gone home and the security guards are at the entrance below. We are going to imagine a moment, just an imagined moment, and we are going to ask what the chamber was for, if we read the ancient sources for what they actually say. The king's chamber is not in any obvious way a tomb. No mummy has ever been found in it. No grave goods have ever been recovered from it. The famous sarcophagus, the granite box at the western end of the chamber, has no inscriptions, no funerary texts, no carvings of any kind. It is a plain, polished, hollow rectangular vessel, and when you strike it gently with your hand, it rings. It rings, and the ringing fills the chamber, and the chamber, with its bare granite walls and its high corbelled ceiling, returns the ringing back in echoes that build on themselves until the air seems to vibrate. Several modern researchers, including the engineer Christopher Dunn in his 1998 book The Giza Power Plant, have proposed that the Great Pyramid was not a tomb at all, but a machine for producing or focusing energy. The king's chamber, in this reading, is the resonant cavity of the machine, and the granite box is part of its mechanism. The pyramid as a whole, with its precisely cut chambers, its mysterious shafts, its careful alignment to the cardinal directions, and its enormous mass concentrated over a single point, would, in this view, function as a kind of large acoustic resonator. Whether to generate vibration, to focus vibration from external sources, or to use vibration in some other way, the engineer's argument runs that the structural features of the pyramid are consistent with an acoustic function. They are not consistent with a tomb function. This is a controversial reading. Mainstream Egyptology rejects it. Most Egyptologists insist that the pyramid was a tomb for the pharaoh Khufu, that the sarcophagus held his body, that the absence of grave goods is due to ancient looting, and that the acoustic properties of the chamber are coincidental side effects of the construction materials and geometry. This is a reasonable position, and it is held by most of the specialists in the field. But it is worth noting that even the mainstream position does not have a complete explanation for many features of the pyramid. Why was so much labor expended on the precise polishing of the inner surfaces of the chambers, which would never have been seen after the burial? Why were the shafts oriented to specific stars in a way that required calculations of considerable astronomical sophistication? Why does the king's chamber resonate at a frequency that has been measured in modern acoustic tests to be very close to the natural resonant frequency of certain mineral crystals and to certain biological cycles in the human body? These questions do not have settled answers. The mainstream answers them by saying that the religious and aesthetic preferences of the Egyptians explain the polishing, that astronomical alignment had religious significance for the soul's journey to the stars, and that the acoustic frequencies are not unusual for a chamber of that size and material. The unconventional answers say that the polishing facilitated acoustic reflection, that the astronomical alignment connected the pyramid to celestial sources of vibration or energy, and that the resonant frequencies were chosen deliberately because of their effects on materials and on people. Either set of answers is internally consistent. The mainstream answers fit better with what we know of Egyptian religion. The unconventional answers fit better with what we know of the global pattern of megalithic acoustic features. For tonight, we are going to leave the question of the pyramid open. We are not going to insist that it was a power plant. We are not going to insist that it was only a tomb. We are simply going to note that, in addition to its other features, it is one of the most acoustically remarkable structures ever built, and that this fact deserves more attention than it usually receives. The Egyptians, who built it, did not write down what it was for. The hieroglyphic inscriptions inside the pyramid, of which there are very few, do not include any explanation of its function. We are left to infer, and the inferences, if we are willing to consider all the evidence, including the global pattern of acoustic monuments, point toward a structure that, among its other purposes, was designed to interact with sound. The same is true of many other Egyptian monuments. The Temple of Hathor at Dendera, for example, contains a curious crypt in its lower levels, a small chamber decorated with reliefs showing figures holding objects that look strikingly like elongated bulbs, with internal filaments visible through translucent shells. The conventional interpretation of these reliefs is that they depict creation symbols. The unconventional interpretation, advocated by certain researchers since the late 20th century, is that they depict some kind of electrical or vibrational devices. The crypt itself has unusual acoustic properties. Its small size and shape produce strong resonance at specific frequencies. The walls, painted with figures and inscriptions, look in some lighting conditions as if they are vibrating. We are not going to dwell on the Dendera reliefs. They are a small piece of a larger puzzle. The point is that the Egyptian temples, the Mesopotamian ziggurats, the Andean platforms, the British stone circles, and the Anatolian enclosures of Göbekli Tepe all share certain features that, taken together, suggest a common preoccupation with acoustic and vibrational properties of large stone structures. The cultures that built these monuments lived in widely different environments, spoke widely different languages, and worshipped widely different gods. But they all built structures with these particular features. The simplest explanation for the convergence is shared inheritance. They all received the same instruction from the same source at some early point in their history. And that source, according to the cultures themselves, was a class of teachers who came from somewhere outside the ordinary human world. The night is moving along. Your breathing has slowed. The voice continues. We have many hours yet, if you want to listen, and we will keep walking. Let us turn now to a question that often comes up when this topic is discussed, which is the question of whether any modern experiments have ever demonstrated acoustic levitation in the ancient sense. The answer is a qualified yes, with important limitations. Modern physics has developed several techniques in the late 20th and early 21st centuries for levitating small objects using sound waves. The most familiar is acoustic levitation in air, in which standing waves between two transducers are used to suspend particles, droplets, or small solid objects at the nodes of the standing wave pattern. This technique has been demonstrated in laboratories around the world, and it works. The objects are typically very small, on the order of millimeters, and the acoustic intensities required are very high. Researchers have also demonstrated phased ultrasonic levitation of small beads and droplets. The techniques are impressive, but are still limited to objects with masses measured in grams, not tons. What modern physics has not demonstrated, and what conventional physics says is not possible, is the levitation of multi-ton stone blocks by audible sound waves produced by human voices and simple acoustic instruments. The energy requirements exceed what those sources can produce by many orders of magnitude. If the Anunnaki technique actually worked, it must have worked by means that go beyond ordinary acoustic levitation. It must have involved either an energy source that the chant tapped into, of the sort that the Sumerians called the Gish, Bil, or it must have involved a different relationship between vibration and matter than the one our current physics describes, or it must have been a metaphorical story that we have been overinterpreting. Each of these possibilities has its advocates. The first, the tapping into a hidden energy source, is the position taken by various researchers in what is sometimes called fringe physics, the loose body of work that explores possibilities not accepted by the mainstream. Some of these researchers point to claimed observations of unusual energetic effects in the vicinity of megalithic sites, to gravimetric anomalies, to electromagnetic anomalies, to subtle physiological effects on humans visiting these sites. The observations, where they are documented at all, are typically not robust enough to convince mainstream physics, but they continue to be reported. The second possibility, that vibration and matter have a different relationship than current physics describes, is the position taken by certain modern physicists working at the boundaries of theory. There are speculative frameworks in physics that, if developed, might in principle allow for matter to be temporarily altered in its inertial properties by exposure to specific vibrational fields. None of these frameworks is mainstream. None has experimental support. But they exist as theoretical possibilities, and they keep the door open, at least slightly, to the idea that the ancient claims might one day be vindicated by physics that we have not yet developed. The third possibility, that the ancient stories are entirely metaphorical, is the default mainstream position. It is the position that requires the fewest assumptions. It is also the position that has to dismiss a remarkable amount of consistent cross-cultural testimony as either coincidence or shared misunderstanding. It is, in other words, the parsimonious position, but it is also the position that asks us to attribute a strange systematic blindness to the ancients in this one specific area, while crediting them with great competence in other areas like astronomy, mathematics, and architecture. Tonight, we are not going to settle the question. We are not going to declare one possibility correct and the others wrong. We are going to leave the question open, the way the ancient texts themselves left it open. The Sumerians did not give us a physics textbook. They gave us hymns and procedures. They told us that the procedures worked. They told us that the procedures had been given by the Anunnaki, and then they preserved what they could, knowing that the full knowledge was already slipping away even in their own time. Your eyes may be closed. Your breath is even. You may be at the edge of sleep, or you may have slipped over the edge and back again. Either way, the voice keeps going. The story will be here. The Anunnaki, the stones, the sound, the long lines of ancient priests passing the knowledge from one to the next until the line broke and the knowledge was gone. It is all here, in the warm darkness of the room, in the slow rhythm of the words. Let us continue. Let us go now to a particular type of evidence that has not yet been considered tonight, which is the evidence of language itself. The Sumerian language, the language in which the Anunnaki texts were first written, is a linguistic isolate. This means that it has no known relatives. Most languages of the world fall into families. English is part of the Indo-European family. Arabic and Hebrew are part of the Semitic family. Chinese is part of the Sino-Tibetan family, but Sumerian has no relatives. When the Sumerians were writing their tablets, around 3,000 years before the Common Era, they were speaking a language unrelated to anything else around them. The Sumerians themselves had a tradition about this. They said that their ancestors had come from a place they called Dilmun, located somewhere to the east or southeast of Mesopotamia, in the direction of the Persian Gulf. Dilmun is identified, by most modern scholars, with the island of Bahrain or perhaps with the larger region of the Arabian Peninsula. The Sumerians remembered Dilmun as a paradise, a pure and bright land. From Dilmun, they said, their first ancestors had migrated, traveling by water up the Gulf to the mouth of the rivers, where they had settled and built the first cities. With them they had brought their language, their knowledge, and their gods. The texts repeatedly insist that Sumerian is, in some sense, a gift. The language was not invented by humans. It was given. The Anunnaki, when they came, taught the people they encountered to speak in this particular way. The Sumerian word for language is eme, and the word for tongue is also eme, and the texts treat them as essentially identical. The eme is given by the gods. It carries the gods' patterns. It is a vehicle of the divine ordinances, the me, which we have discussed. This interpretation is consistent with another feature of the language that mainstream linguistics finds interesting. Sumerian has a very high information density. The language packs an unusual amount of grammatical and semantic information into very short forms. A single Sumerian word can contain a verb root, an aspect marker, a tense marker, a person marker, a number marker, and several other affixes, all telescoped together. The resulting structure is reminiscent of mathematical notation rather than of ordinary spoken language. Reading Sumerian is a bit like reading equations. Each cluster of signs carries dense and precise meaning. There is little redundancy. Now there is something we should note about this. The Anunnaki texts, the technical hymns describing the procedures, are written in Sumerian. They were preserved in Sumerian even by cultures that did not speak Sumerian. The Babylonians, the Assyrians, the Hittites, when they copied these texts, copied them in Sumerian, often with interlinear translations in their own languages. They did this because they believed that the power of the texts was tied to the language. The chant, the lifting chant, had to be sung in Sumerian. To translate it into another tongue would destroy its efficacy. The Sumerian words, in particular the technical Emersal dialect words, were considered the necessary form of the procedure. Just as a chemical formula does not work if you change its symbols, a Sumerian ritual chant did not work if you changed its language. This belief, that the form of the language matters as much as the meaning, is one of the oldest theological positions in the ancient world. It is reflected, later, in the Hindu insistence that the Vedas must be recited in the original Sanskrit with the original pronunciation, or they lose their effect. It is reflected in the Hebrew insistence that the Torah must be read in Hebrew, in the precise consonantal forms. It is reflected in the Quranic insistence that the recitation of the Quran in any language other than Arabic is not the Quran. All of these traditions inherit, in different ways, the older Sumerian principle that sacred speech is not arbitrary. The actual sounds carry power. The words are not just labels for ideas, the words themselves are part of the procedure. If we apply this to the stone-moving chant, the implication is that we cannot recover the procedure simply by knowing what the words meant. To make the chant work, we would have to pronounce it correctly, in the original Sumerian, with the correct pitches, the correct rhythms, the correct vocal qualities. And these are precisely the things that have been lost. We have the texts, we have the meanings, but we do not have the live tradition. The last people who knew how to chant Sumerian in the priestly way died more than 2,000 years ago. The language as a spoken instrument is gone. What we have are silent inscriptions on clay. The chant is on the tablet, but the chant cannot be sung. Not really. Not in the way it was sung. The bridge between knowing the words and knowing the procedure has been broken. This may be why the Anunnaki tradition emphasized so heavily the lineage of the En, the master of the chant. The lineage was the living memory. The lineage was how the chant stayed alive from one generation to the next. As long as there were trained Ends, the procedure could be performed. When the lineage of the Ends was broken, somewhere in the late Bronze Age, the procedure was lost, regardless of how many tablets survived. The tablets were never sufficient by themselves. They were notes. They were reminders for those who already knew. They were not, and could never be, the substitute for direct transmission. There is a sad and beautiful quality to this realization. The Sumerians knew it would happen. They wrote in several texts about the danger that the knowledge would be lost. They wrote about the importance of training the next generation of Ends. They wrote about the procedures for preserving the lineage during times of war, of plague, of social upheaval. They were aware that they were caretakers of something fragile, that the chain of voices stretching back to the original Anunnaki teachers could be broken, and that once broken it could not be repaired. They did everything they could to keep the chain unbroken. They failed, eventually, but it was not for lack of effort. The civilization that produced these texts cared deeply about preserving them. It is a kind of testament to that care that we still have the tablets, 4,000 years later, to puzzle over and to interpret. Let us slow down once more and breathe. The story is now several hours into the night. You may have drifted in and out of sleep many times. That is the proper way to listen to this kind of material. The mind does not need to capture every detail. The mind needs to rest in the long patterns of the story, the cadence of the names, the recurring shapes of the same idea appearing in different cultures, the soft accumulation of evidence and counter-evidence, of texts and stones and folklore and modern science, all swirling together in the quiet darkness of the night. We will continue. Now we will turn to a question that I have been deferring throughout this entire telling, which is the question of why the knowledge was lost. If the Anunnaki really did teach humans how to move stones by sound, and if humans really did practice this technique for thousands of years, building monuments that we now consider impossible by ordinary means, what happened? Why did the knowledge fade? Why are we, in the present, unable to do what our ancestors could do? The texts themselves offer several answers, which we can group into three broad categories. The first answer is that the knowledge was deliberately withdrawn. The Anunnaki, having taught humans certain things, decided at some point that the teaching had gone far enough. Certain higher knowledge was simply taken back. The tablets describe a moment of withdrawal, often associated with the Great Flood, in which the Anunnaki gathered up the most powerful of the Me, the divine ordinances, and removed them from human access. The dub, Shen, the tablet of the rising sound, may have been one of the things taken back, or sealed away in a manner that made it inaccessible to the post-flood human race. In this view, the loss of the knowledge was not a tragedy of negligence. It was a deliberate decision by the teachers, who had concluded that humans were not ready to keep handling something so powerful. The second answer is that the knowledge was lost through cultural disruption. The ancient Near East, like every other part of the world, has experienced repeated waves of conquest, migration, plague, climate change, and political collapse. Civilizations rose and fell. Cities were burned. Libraries were destroyed. Lineages were broken. The continuous transmission that the Anunnaki tradition required from one end to the next over hundreds of generations was a fragile thing. It only took one disastrous century to interrupt the chain in any given city, and once interrupted, the chain could not easily be re-established. The masters who had memorized the chants were old men by the time they trained their successors. If a war killed the master before the successor was fully trained, the chain at that location died. Over the course of the second and first millennia before the Common Era, with all their wars and migrations, enough chains were broken in enough places that the traditions simply ran out. The third answer is that the knowledge was lost because the conditions that had made it possible changed. The Sumerians, you will remember, said that the chant worked only at certain sites where the Gish, Bil, ran strong beneath the earth. They also said that the chant worked only with living stone, freshly quarried, within a certain time window. They also said that the chant worked only at certain seasons, under certain celestial alignments. If any of these conditions were no longer present, the chant would not work, even if all the other elements were correctly maintained. Over very long periods of geological time, underground energy patterns could shift, climate could change. Celestial alignments precess and recur, but in slowly evolving patterns. It is conceivable that the conditions that had made the procedure possible during the period of intense Anunnaki teaching, sometime in the late Ice Age or early Holocene, gradually became less favorable as the geological and astronomical situation evolved. By the late Bronze Age, even at the original sites, the chant may have been producing less and less effect, and by the Iron Age, the chant may have been producing no effect at all, regardless of how well the ritual was performed. These three answers are not mutually exclusive. All three might be true at once. The Anunnaki withdrew the highest knowledge. The political and cultural chaos of the late Bronze Age broke the chains of transmission, and the natural conditions evolved away from the parameters required by the procedure. The result was a slow fading, over centuries, until what had once been a working technique became only a story. The story was preserved, in the tablets, but the technique was gone. But let us return to the central thread of our story. We have looked at the textual evidence from Sumer, from Egypt, from India, from Lebanon, from the Andes. We have looked at the physical evidence of the stones themselves, at Sacsayhuaman, at Baalbek, at Giza, at Göbekli Tepe. We have looked at the modern science of acoustic levitation. We have looked at the linguistic question of why the chant required the Sumerian language, and what does it add up to? It adds up to the outline of a picture of a forgotten technology. A technology that, if real, would change much of what we think we know about the deep past. A technology whose plausible existence is supported by an unusually consistent body of cross-cultural evidence. A technology that the ancients themselves were quite clear about, and that they attributed with one voice to teachers who had come from somewhere beyond. The implications, if we take this picture seriously, are large. They suggest that human civilization at its origins had access to a kind of knowledge that we no longer have. They suggest that this knowledge was lost, not because it never existed, but because the conditions of its preservation failed. They suggest that the great monuments of the ancient world, which have been a puzzle to engineers and architects for centuries, may yet have an explanation, and that the explanation involves something we do not yet fully understand about the relationship between sound, matter, and energy. And they suggest that the Anunnaki, whoever or whatever they really were, deserve to be taken more seriously than the dismissive treatment they usually receive in mainstream histories of the ancient Near East. Now I want to take you somewhere else for a while. I want to bring you back to a quiet evening, in a quiet place, where one of the last great preservers of the old tradition lived and worked. His name was Berosus. He was a Babylonian priest, of the priesthood of Marduk, in the great temple of Esagila in the city of Babylon, in the 3rd century before the Common Era. He lived through the conquest of Babylon by Alexander the Great, through the wars of Alexander's successors, through the rise of the Seleucid Greek dynasty that ruled Babylon after Alexander's death. He saw the old world coming apart around him. He saw the temple traditions weakening. He saw the lineages of priests being broken. Berosus decided to write a book. He titled it The Babyloniaca, the Babylonian History. He hoped that by writing it in Greek, the language of the new rulers, he could pass the knowledge to the new world, so that even if the priesthood of Babylon eventually died out, the knowledge would survive in some form. The full text was lost sometime in the centuries after Berosus's death. What has survived are fragments, quoted by later Greek and Roman authors. And one of the things Berosus tried to convey, very clearly, was that the great monuments of Mesopotamia had been built with the assistance of the Anunnaki, by methods that involved the application of sacred sound. He describes the construction of the original ziggurat at Babylon, the one that the biblical story remembers as the Tower of Babel. He says that the foundation stones were set in place by a method that he calls, in Greek, the music of the gods. Berosus also describes the arrival of the original teachers of his people. He calls them the Apkallu, which is the Akkadian name for what the Sumerians called the Seven Sages. The Apkallu, in Berosus's account, came up out of the Persian Gulf, in the deep past, before the flood. They appeared on the shore, in a place near the city of Eridu. They had bodies that were partly like fish and partly like humans. They could not eat human food. They lived in the water during the night and came out onto the land during the day to teach the people. They taught the people writing, mathematics, astronomy, agriculture, the working of metals, the carving of stones, and the building of cities. Each Apkallu had a name. The first was called Oannes, in the Greek version of Berosus's text. The Apkallu, in the Babylonian tradition, were the messengers of the Anunnaki. They were physically present. They walked the streets of Eridu. They taught generations of human apprentices. And then, when their work was done, they departed, returning to the waters of the Gulf or, in some versions, ascending to the sky to rejoin the Anunnaki. The lineage of the human ends descended from these original apprentices who had been trained directly by the Apkallu. Mainstream scholarship interprets the Apkallu as a mythological construct. The fish body, in this interpretation, is a symbol of wisdom rising from the abyss, the deep waters being a metaphor for the unknown depths of cosmic knowledge. But it is worth noting that the Babylonians themselves, including a sober and educated priest like Berosus, did not present the Apkallu as a symbol. They presented them as actual beings who had actually appeared at a particular place at a particular time. The mythological interpretation is ours. The Babylonian interpretation was literal. Take another breath. Settle in. The room is dark. The hour is late. You may be very near sleep now, if not already there. The voice continues. The story winds on. We have more to share, but it can drift over you as softly as the rest. Let the names come and go. Marduk, Enki, Enlil, Ningersu, Inanna, Nergal, Ereshkigal, Nana, Utu. Let them pass through your mind like figures in a slow procession, with their staffs and their robes and their tall crowns, walking through a city of brick and reed, with the smell of date palms in the air and the sound of the wind blowing across the wide plain. We have not yet talked about Inanna directly, but her story belongs in this picture. Inanna was the goddess of love and of war, the queen of heaven, the morning and evening star, the patron of the city of Uruk. In the great poem of her descent into the underworld, she gathers 7 mi of her divine power before her journey. These are not arbitrary objects. Each corresponds to a specific aspect of the high knowledge. Among them are ear pendants, which are described in the original text as objects that allow her to hear the divine sound. They are not ordinary decorations. They are functional. They enable a kind of perception that ordinary beings do not have. With the ear pendants, Inanna can hear the chants that move the stones. She can hear the underground voices of the Gish, Bil. Without the ear pendants, she is acoustically deaf, in this technical sense. The tradition distinguishes, in this small detail, between 2 kinds of beings, those who can hear the divine sound and those who cannot. The Anunnaki themselves can hear it natively. The high priests, the Ends, can hear it after their long initiation. Ordinary humans cannot hear it at all, not in the relevant way. They hear only the surface of the chant, not the underlying vibrational structure that makes it work. Let us drift now toward a different region, a different culture, but one connected by the same underlying threads. The Neolithic megalithic cultures of the Mediterranean were in contact, indirectly, with the cultures of the Levant and ultimately with the cultures of the Mesopotamian river valleys. Trade goods moved across this region from very early times. Ideas moved with the goods, and across these distant cultures, the same acoustic signature appears in the great chambers they built. Certain underground passages, certain inner sanctuaries, certain stone enclosures, all show resonant peaks in the same general acoustic range, around 110 Hz. The frequency falls within what is called the alpha range of human brainwave activity. When humans hear sustained tones in this range, there are documented effects on brain activity, including increases in alpha wave production and mild changes in emotional state. Some studies have suggested that exposure to tones around this frequency can induce mildly altered states of consciousness. If the ancient builders of these chambers knew this, even empirically through observation, then the chambers were designed not just to amplify sound, but to alter the consciousness of the people inside. The chambers were instruments for changing the state of the mind. The mind, in an altered state, became receptive to the further teaching of the priest or, in the Anunnaki framework, the N performing the rite. This puts the sound technology in a new light. It is not just about moving stones. It is about moving minds. The sacred chant, performed in a properly designed chamber, did two things at once. It interacted with the physical structure of the chamber to produce certain acoustic effects, which may have included subtle vibrational influences on nearby materials, and it interacted with the brains of the participants to produce certain neurological effects, which made them more receptive, more attentive, more present. The combination of these two interactions was, in the ancient understanding, the divine technology in its fullness. The sound was for the stones, and the sound was for the souls, both at the same time. For the ancients, the stones and the souls were part of one continuous reality. The chant moved both, because both were responsive to the same kind of subtle structuring of energy. We are now well into the late hours. The story has been long, the voice has been steady. If you are still awake, I commend you. If you are not, the story has done what it set out to do, which is to ferry you gently across into the country of sleep, where the deep mind processes things in its own way and brings up tomorrow morning whatever it has gathered. We will continue for a while longer, in the same slow rhythm, because there are still some pieces of the picture we have not put in place. Let us now zoom out. We have been gathering material for many hours. Let us try to step back and see what the whole picture looks like. The picture has multiple layers. There is the textual layer, the Sumerian and Akkadian and Babylonian tablets that describe the Anunnaki and their teachings. There is the architectural layer, the great monuments of Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Levant, the Andes, the Mediterranean, and the British Isles, all of which display features consistent with acoustic design and acoustic construction. There is the folkloric layer, the local oral traditions that preserve stories of teachers from elsewhere who knew how to move stones with sound. There is the linguistic layer, the structural peculiarities of Sumerian, and the insistence of ancient cultures on the irreplaceability of sacred language. There is the modern science layer, with its limited but real demonstrations of acoustic levitation and its growing study of the acoustic properties of ancient monuments. All of these layers tell, in their different ways, the same story. The story is that there was once a body of knowledge, given by teachers whose origin the ancients placed beyond the ordinary world, that allowed for the manipulation of matter through the application of sound. This knowledge was applied in particular to the construction of large stone monuments. The knowledge was preserved by lineages of trained specialists for thousands of years. It was eventually lost through some combination of deliberate withdrawal, cultural disruption, and changing conditions. The full procedure has not been reconstructed and may never be reconstructed without either the rediscovery of lost documents or the development of new physics that can make sense of the underlying mechanism. This is a story that mainstream history does not tell. Mainstream history tells a different story, in which the great monuments were built by ordinary methods that have been more or less worked out by modern engineers, in which the Anunnaki were the gods of an early polytheistic people who attributed their own achievements to divine inspiration, and in which the stories of teachers from beyond are mythological metaphors that need not be taken literally. The mainstream story is well supported in many respects, and it deserves the consideration it receives. But it leaves a residue. It leaves features of the evidence unaccounted for. It leaves the largest stones at Baalbek as a mystery. It leaves the precision of Sacsayhuaman as a puzzle. It leaves the acoustic properties of the Great Pyramid as a coincidence. The mainstream story is parsimonious in its assumptions, but extravagant in the coincidences it requires. I am not asking you on this night to believe the alternative story. I am asking you only to consider it, to hold it in the same mind that holds the mainstream story, to let both stories sit, side by side, and to notice which features of the evidence each story explains, and which features it does not. The ancients told us their story. We have been told, by our own scholarly tradition, to set their story aside. But there are reasons, careful and considered reasons, to wonder whether we have been too quick to set it aside. The tablets exist. The stones exist. The folklore exists. The accounts exist. The acoustic peculiarities exist. None of this is going to go away. Future generations will continue to confront the evidence, and future generations may, in time, develop the conceptual tools to make sense of what we now find puzzling. For now, on this quiet night, with the room dark and the hour late, we have done what we can do. We have walked together through the libraries of the ancient world. We have read the tablets. We have visited the monuments in imagination. We have considered the question. We have held it gently, without forcing a conclusion. We have let the evidence speak, in its many voices, and we have listened. Take a slow breath now. The night is wide. The story has been long. There is more to say, but for the moment, let us let it rest. The voice will continue. The names will keep coming. The Anunnaki will keep walking through the dim corners of memory, with their tall crowns and their flowing robes and their hidden faces. The stones will keep their secrets. And we, in our small warm room, will keep moving toward morning, on the slow tide of breath and sound, and the ancient story of how the world might have been, before everything we now know was set down on the surface of it. Let me bring you to one more place before the night runs out. Let me bring you to Tiwanaku again, to the high plateau, to the great open courtyard called the Kala Sasaya, which means in Aymara the place of the standing stones. In the center of the Kala Sasaya there is a sunken court, and in the sunken court there is a great monolithic gateway carved from a single piece of andesite. The gateway is called the Gate of the Sunday. It weighs about 10 tons. It stands about 3 meters high, and it is carved, across its upper lintel, with a relief showing a central figure surrounded by what appear to be smaller figures. The central figure on the Gate of the Sun is sometimes called Viracocha, the creator god of the Andean tradition. He stands frontally, with his arms outstretched, holding 2 staffs, one in each hand. His face is large, with prominent eyes, and a sunray crown emanating from his head. Around him, in 3 horizontal rows, there are 48 smaller figures, each shown in profile, each running toward the central figure with their own smaller staffs. The mainstream interpretation is that the scene depicts the daily cycle of the sun, but there is an alternative reading that sees the central figure as a teacher rather than a god. The staffs in his hands are not symbols of authority, but instruments of work. The smaller figures around him are not attendants, but students. The scene depicts a moment of teaching, commemorated in the very stone of the gateway, as a permanent record of the founding act that made Tiwanaku possible. The figure on the Gate of the Sun, when you look at it carefully, has a face that does not match the faces of the smaller figures around him. The smaller figures have human features, in the Andean style, with their hooked noses and their narrow eyes. The central figure has a different face. His eyes are wide and forward-facing. His mouth is set in a thin line. His head is squared off, with a regular geometric outline that the smaller figures lack. He is, in a visual sense, a different kind of being from those around him. The relief is making, in its silent stone way, the same distinction that the Mesopotamian texts make in their written way. The teacher is not one of the students. The teacher is something else. The teacher is from elsewhere. The Andean tradition, in its older, purer form before the Spanish conquest, held that the giants had been the first inhabitants of the high plateau. They were called the Huaris, in some accounts, or the Wariwiracocha, the White Teachers. They had built Tiwanaku and certain other great sites in the southern Andes, and they had then, for reasons that the tradition does not fully explain, retreated underground. The Aymara elders said that the giants still existed, beneath the earth, in great caverns near the lake, but that they would only emerge again at the end of the current world age. When the end came, the giants would rise, and they would teach the new humans the songs that had been forgotten, and the lifting of the stones would resume. This is an eschatology. It is the Andean version of the widespread belief that, at the end of time, what was lost will be restored. We see similar beliefs in many traditions. The Hindu Kali Yuga gives way to a new Satya Yuga in which the Dharma is renewed. The biblical apocalypse leads to a new heavens and a new earth. The Norse Ragnarok is followed by the rebirth of the world. The Andean version places the lost knowledge at the center of the renewal. The end of the age, in this telling, is specifically the moment when the technology of the giants returns. The stones will rise again, the sound will be heard again, and the world, in its renewed form, will be a world in which humans have once more learned to do what their first teachers did. You may be drifting. As I speak these words, the hour is late. The voice has been steady for a long time. The Anunnaki, the Apkallu, the Huaris, the giants, all the various names for the teachers who came and went, are by now circling in your mind like figures in a slow tapestry. They are not really separate figures. They are the same figure, seen from different angles, by different cultures, in different centuries. The teacher who came from outside, who knew the sound, who taught a small number of humans, and who departed, leaving behind a body of knowledge that was too large for the students to fully hold. The teacher is one. The names are many. The story, beneath the names, is one. This is the story tonight. This is the story we have been telling. It is a story that does not arrive at a conclusion. It is a story that opens, instead, into a long question. The question is whether the world we live in now is the world we think it is, or whether, behind the surface of what we know, there is another world, an older world, a world in which different rules applied, in which different technologies worked, in which different beings walked among us and taught our ancestors what they could not have learned on their own. The question cannot be settled. We can only ask it. And we can only hold the ancient evidence with the respect it deserves, neither dismissing it nor inflating it, but reading it carefully, in its own terms, and letting it speak to us across the gulf of time. Now I want to bring this long journey to a slow close. We will not stop abruptly. We will taper, the way a long song tapers, with the last notes growing softer and softer until they vanish into silence. And maybe they did. Maybe, in some old dawn or some old dusk, on the river plain or the high plateau or the chalk down or the Levantine valley, a circle of voices rose, and a stone trembled, and the stone lifted. Maybe the lifting was a brief and beautiful thing, lasting only a moment, requiring a precise alignment of conditions that has not occurred again in our time. Maybe the lifting happened many times, over many centuries, by many lineages of singers, before the conditions changed and the chain was broken. Maybe the lifting never happened at all, and the story is a long collective dream that our species has dreamed under the same stars for 10,000 years. We do not know. We cannot know. We can only listen to the story and feel it, and let it shape the way we look at the old monuments and the old tablets and the old worn stones that wait for us in the deserts and the highlands and the chambered hills of the earth. The voice will continue for a little while longer, but the substance of the journey is complete. We have visited the libraries, the temples, the courts, the deserts of the imagination. We have read the tablets and considered the stones. We have heard the testimony of priests, of chroniclers, of travelers, of folk elders, of modern researchers. We have weighed the question and left it weighing. The answer is not ours to deliver. The answer will come, if it comes at all, in the slow ripening of evidence and the slow ripening of understanding, over centuries that we will not live to see. For now, we have tonight, we have the quiet of the room, we have the warmth of the bedding, we have the steady rhythm of the words. And we have the long story of the people who came before us, who believed that the world was singable, that the stones had voices, and that the voices, raised together at the right time in the right place, could lift the very mountains, just a little, just enough to set them gently in the new world. Let me say a few last things, very quietly. The first is that, whatever we conclude about the literal truth of the Anunnaki story, the story has value as a story. It connects us to our deepest ancestors. It shows us how they understood themselves, how they understood the world, how they understood the origin of their own civilization. The Sumerians did not write down the names of their merchants. They wrote down the names of their gods and the names of their kings and the names of their masters of the chant. They preserved their cosmology. They preserved their procedures for the temples. They preserved their accounts of the visitors. They preserved, in other words, what they considered the high knowledge. The fact that the high knowledge included a method for moving stones by sound tells us something about what they valued. The question of the Anunnaki and of the lost sound technology is part of a larger question about the deep past. The deep past, the past before written history, is much vaster than the past after written history. Humans have been around, in something like our current form, for at least 200,000 years. Written records cover the last 5,000. There is, in other words, 195,000 years of human existence, about which we have no direct documentation. The deep past is mostly silent. We have inferred a great deal from archaeology, but archaeology gives us bones and tools and the broken remains of dwellings. It does not give us the inner life of those who lived through those long, quiet centuries. The Anunnaki story, in its various cultural forms, is one of the few windows we have into what those deep ancestors believed about themselves. It is a window we should not close too quickly, and whether or not the sound technology of the ancients was real, the very fact that they believed in it tells us something about human imagination. Humans, across all cultures, have wanted to believe that there was a way to overcome the heaviness of the world, that the stones, which seem so immobile, could be moved by something as intangible as a song. That matter is not as solid, as final, as obstructive as it seems. The wish behind the technology is a wish for the responsiveness of the world to the human voice, the wish for the world to listen and to answer. This wish is at the heart of religion, at the heart of art, at the heart of love. The Anunnaki technology, real or imagined, was an attempt to actualize this wish in the most literal possible way by making the stones respond to the song. The wind is settling, the night is deep, the voice goes quiet, the story rests. The stones stay where they are, for now, and we, in our small, warm room, drift slowly into the place where all stories go when they are finished being told, the place where every voice merges into a single long, quiet sound, and the sound holds us, gently, until the morning comes. Sleep well, sleep well, sleep well.